we come together here the second time to register and also identify our conversation as to where we would like to go with this project. And I want to quickly just remind us that the first time we had such more attentive and concentrated conversation, one element that came out was the experience of fire. And this next conversation that we together decided would be actually in the light of the third conversation, or the third step in this exchange, and that is actually coming together maybe with a bit more people than just the three of us. So we invite each other to think how we could open this conversation to others, especially at the center where you both work. And there are many things we should discuss, but it's more of a brainstorm in preparation of a getting together that leads to the articulation of some very serious problems. And I would like to prepare this conversation with you today. Please join in. Where do you think we can start thinking of a next step in which we invite more people?
I was going to say, I think, you know, from the last conversation that we had, I think it was really useful to know a little bit about our backgrounds and our relationships with fire. And I just wonder whether that's something we should also consider in terms of this next conversation that we're thinking about with the wider group in the centre, to try to kind of to get a sense of how people relate to fire on a more personal basis. I think might be quite a useful and interesting perspective for all of us, because it's something that I feel I actually don't really know. That I know what people do research on, but I don't actually know what their experiences or personal relationship with fire is. So I wonder if that's something that we could consider as part of that conversation.
And I think also how those personal experiences shape people's research, if at all, is quite an interesting question to discuss. Is there any relationship between their research and personal experiences of fire?
Yeah.
I think an important question is about who within the centre we would invite to be part of this conversation, because I think there's quite a big range of people from very early career researchers who are starting out in their PhDs and have been working on fire for like a year or less in some cases, versus people who have a long career behind them already thinking about fire and working with fire. So I don't know if we want a mixture of those people or whether we want to focus on one group or the other for this first kind of step of involving other people in the centre in this conversation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, my personal feeling is that, well, I don't want to say about necessarily define exactly who, but I think people, because our question's about kind of translating, moving data from the local to the global, I think it would be useful to have people who are working at the more global scale, just so that is also part of the mix in terms of this conversation that we're going to have next. So I'm not sure whether they should be people who have just recently started or who have a long term, but maybe we can have a mix. I don't know, Christina, have you any thoughts on, you know, how much experience do you need to have to talk about your experiences? I don't know.
Yeah, what comes to my mind is in relation to the research question, which is or research, or key questions that has accompanied us in our conversation is the trajectory that data take from a local source on all the mutations and modulations and format changes and different systems of order or categorizations until they are on a global scale. And so it could be interesting to repeat that also in terms of people involved, to have people, let's say, along that line, so that we, in a way, a kind of observe how the data goes from one hand into the other, and each stage can be then also represented by a PhD student or a professor or someone from this department. But I think our question sort of extends or transgresses this these smaller specialized fields,
Mm-hmm.
and it could be interesting to have at least a range of people. The example for me would be like the sun coming to the earth, like a photon. Imagine a photon from the sun coming to my face now. How many disciplines does this photon transgress? You know, how many people are involved in knowing this ray of sun until it comes into my face? So, but we never look at that entire range. We always look at a specific obviously, I mean, it might not be possible to overview everything, but maybe this conversation can be in the favor of like center immanently in a bit of a transdisciplinary or disciplinary crossing or conversation. Always along this trajectory of the data, to take this along. So this is what I could imagine.
Mm-hmm.
And are they people? Can you see such a line in your center? If you think of the whatever you call local, whatever you call global, can you see?
I don't think we have the middle ground so well represented. I think we have a lot of people, particularly PhD students, who are working in local places. Like, for example, Jay's PhD student, Kayla, who's working in Guyana in a very specific location. And then we have people who work on these global models, but it's not so many people who take a regional approach or who are kind of integrating information, a kind of middle ground. I don't know, maybe there are a few.
Yeah, I'm just thinking maybe some of the postdocs that might be doing that. Yeah, I think we need to have a think. And it's also, it would be quite interesting to kind of like properly understand what's actually happening in that middle ground. You know, what is actually happening in terms of the movement of the data, you know. So yeah, you know, because you have your local data, you have the data that's collected at the local scale, and then when you might hand that over to somebody, there's an element, I suppose, I'm just thinking, if you think of Cathy's work, so there's the data that was collected by people, researchers at the local scale. She's taken that information. In fact, she's probably, you've done one step, haven't you? You've done one of the kind of data transformation steps. And then I'm just thinking the conversation we had quite recently, that, you know, you were talking to Matt, who was in our center, and if you give him your data, is that the next step, or is there something in between you giving him the data, for example? So
it's not another step in scale, because they're both global data sets that we'll be working with, but it's kind of integrating the case study data with other data that's been collected at the global scale.
Yeah. So it could be that we may not be able to necessarily do the kind of, yeah, we'd have to look at what those chains are, and those chains might not be necessarily moving up scale. They could actually be moving at the same, at some point they're at the same scale, and then they might be transformed into something else. So
and there isn't necessarily a chain of transfer within the center. Importantly, a lot of people's data sets have come from people who aren't within the center. Like in my case, I'm collating information from like many researchers all around the world. So we don't have the people, other than in the case of, for example, Jay, or even my own work that's in my own database. We have a couple of those point kind of those case study people that we can speak with, but we obviously don't have links to all of them. And I'm sure it's the same for a lot of other people who work at the global scale with vegetation data or whatever. If any of that is collected on the ground, it might not be by people that we have access to speak to.
mm-hmm.
And could we potentially, so there is not a perfect line or a one linear line, but anyway, we have kind of points on this sort of handover from data to data to data to data. And then again, a transformation of this information into another encoding, another form. Could we ask along that line, or one question we could ask is on whatever scale that the person finds itself in relation to our range, how does this relate to fire?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and also what is the context of your work? So we can ask people about their lived experiences of fire, but we can also ask them about, you know, what is it that they take from the data that they work with, and what are the bigger questions, and what's the human context to their work, and to consider how that might be different from the context in which it was collected, or the context it might go on to serve later.
Mm-hmm.
So we can consider, for example, Jay's case study research and the reasons she did it in the first place, and the questions she was asking, and the purposes she hoped it would serve, and then consider the work that I'm doing, for example, where I'm drawing data from that work for a totally different question, and a different purpose probably, and think about the kind of the ways that purpose changes up the scales too.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really interesting. I think that would be really useful.
Yeah. Do I understand you right, that you ask a little bit to tell about the own context within the own specialization, but also maybe to look just a bit broader to the neighboring, to the scale where it comes from and where it goes to. So just to maybe invite a fantasy of where this comes from and where this goes to, because we probably don't know, but yeah. we yeah. And so in that meeting, the people meet that let's say scientifically don't meet.
Mm-hmm.
Scientifically, the steps are isolated from each other, but we would just try to kind of create meetings from in these different stages where these data find themselves, or we can find, you can find them.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds interesting to me.
So in terms of like, I mean, how are we planning this workshop and thinking how long it would be? And so we kind of talked about the kind of participants, but I think we were talking before maybe a small number. So if Cathy and I were trying to identify people, so we're saying about 5 or 6. I don't know what what your ideas are on that, because like we said, Christina, we were discussing before, we want to ensure that everyone has a chance to talk.
Yeah. So, yeah, and yeah, and for a certain concentration, really understanding each other, it can't be too many people. Mm-hmm. And it's also a beginning, or it's just a start. Mm-hmm. So yes, we said a small amount of people, and I would also say this is not our friends or the people we love most or the people we really like to spend 15 minutes, but it's the people that are next door in relation to this data trajectory. And if there are friends in between, that's great, that's fantastic. But the let's say the choice is more trying to understand, let's say, the trajectory itself, and the different forms of knowledge that are embedded in these different trajectories. And maybe also what I liked very much, what we spoke in a former meeting, also like it could even go before the first data are collected. So it starts very, very early as to what you extrapolate from the specific thing that you extrapolate from a context, and how this extrapolation gets extrapolated again and again and again. So for me, there is, I think it's an interesting conversation, because maybe like the two of us or the three of us, we usually would not talk to each other. Also, maybe something similar can happen by surprise, that within your center people don't talk to each other.
Definitely.